Chapter 1. Why exhibit works of art? What is an art museum for? As the word curator implies, the first and most essential function of such a museum is to take care of ancient or unique works of art which are no longer in their original places or no longer used as was originally intended, and are therefore in danger of destruction by neglect or otherwise. This care of works of art does not necessarily involve their exhibition. If we ask why should the protected works of art be exhibited and made accessible and explained to the public, the answer will be made that this is to be done with an educational purpose. But before we proceed to a consideration of this purpose, before we ask education in or for what, a distinction must be made between the exhibition of the works of living artists and that of ancient or relatively ancient or exotic works of art. It is unnecessary for museums to exhibit the works of living artists, which are not in imminent danger of destruction, or at least, if such works are exhibited, it should be clearly understood that the museum is really advertising the artist and acting on behalf of the art dealer or middleman whose business it is to find a market for the artist. The only difference being that while the museum does the same sort of work as the dealer, it makes no profit. On the other hand, that a living artist should wish to be hung or shown in a museum can be only due to his need or his vanity. For things are made normally for certain purposes and certain places to which they are appropriate, and not simply for exhibition. And because whatever is thus custom-made, i.e., made by an artist for a consumer, is controlled by certain requirements and kept in order. Whereas, as Mr. Steinfels has recently remarked, art which is only intended to be hung on the walls of a museum is one kind of art that need not consider its relationship to its ultimate surroundings. The artist can paint anything he wishes, any way he wishes, and if the curators and trustees like it well enough, they will line it up on the wall with all the other curiosities. We are left with the real problem: why exhibit, as it applies to the relatively ancient or foreign works of art which, because of their fragility and because they no longer correspond to any needs of our own of which we are actively conscious, are preserved in our museums, where they form the bulk of the collections. If we are to exhibit these objects for educational reasons and not as mere curios, it is evident that we are proposing to make such use of them as is possible without an actual handling. It will be imaginatively and not actually that we must use the medieval reliquary, or lie on the Egyptian bed, or make our offering to some ancient deity. The educational ends that an exhibition can serve demand, accordingly, the services not of a curator only who prepares the exhibition, but of a docent who explains the original patron's needs and the original artist's methods. For it is because of what these patrons and artists were that the works before us are what they are. If the exhibition is to be anything more than a show of curiosities and an entertaining spectacle, it will not suffice to be satisfied with our own reactions to the objects. To know why they are what they are, we must know the men that made them. It will not be educational to interpret such objects by our likes or dislikes, or to assume that these men thought of art in our fashion, or that they had aesthetic motives or were expressing themselves. We must examine their theory of art, first of all, in order to understand the things that they made by art, and secondly, in order to ask whether their view of art, if it is found to differ from ours, may not have been a truer one. Let us assume that we are considering an exhibition of Greek objects and call upon Plato to act as our docent. He knows nothing of our distinction of fine from applied arts. For him, painting and agriculture, music and carpentry and pottery are all equally kinds of poetry or making. And as Plotinus, following Plato, tells us, the arts, such as music and carpentry, are not based on human wisdom, but on the thinking there. Whenever Plato speaks disparagingly of the base mechanical arts and of mere labor as distinguished from the fine work of making things, it is with reference to kinds of manufacture that provide for the needs of the body alone. The kind of art that he calls wholesome, and will admit to his ideal state, must be not only useful, but also true to rightly chosen models, and therefore beautiful. And this art, he says, will provide at the same time for the souls and bodies of your citizens. His music stands for all that we mean by culture, and his gymnastics for all that we mean by physical training and well-being. He insists that these ends of culture and physique must never be separately pursued. The tender artist and the brutal athlete are equally contemptible. We, on the other hand, are accustomed to think of music and culture in general as useless, but still valuable. We forget that music, traditionally, is never something only for the ear, something only to be heard, but always the accompaniment of some kind of action. Our own conceptions of culture are typically negative. I believe that Professor Dewey is right in calling our cultural values snobbish. The lessons of the museum must be applied to our life. Because we are not going to handle the exhibited objects, we shall take their aptitude for use, that is to say, their efficiency, for granted, and rather ask in what sense they are also true or significant. For if these objects can no longer serve our bodily needs, perhaps they can still serve those of our soul, or if you prefer the word, our reason. What Plato means by true is iconographically correct. For all the arts, without exception, are representations or likenesses of a model, which does not mean that they are such as to tell us what the model looks like, which would be impossible, seeing that the forms of traditional art are typically imitative of invisible things, which have no looks. But they are such adequate analogies as to be able to remind us, i.e., put us in mind again, of their archetypes. Works of art are reminders, in other words, supports of contemplation. Now, since the contemplation and understanding of these works is to serve the needs of the soul, that is to say, in Plato's own words, to attune our own distorted modes of thought to cosmic harmonies, so that by an assimilation of the knower and the to be known, the archetypal nature, and coming to be in that likeness, we may attain at least to a part in that life's best that has been appointed by the gods to man for this time being and hereafter. Or stated in Indian terms, to effect our own metrical reintegration through the imitation of divine forms. And because, as the Upanishad reminds us, one comes to be of just such stuff as that on which the mind is set, it follows that it is not only requisite that the shapes of art should be adequate reminders of their paradigms, but that the nature of these paradigms themselves must be of the utmost importance if we are thinking of a cultural value of art in any serious sense of the word culture. The what of art is far more important than the how. It should indeed be the what that determines the how, as form determines shape. Plato has always in view the representation of invisible and intelligible forms. The imitation of anything and everything is despicable. It is the actions of gods and heroes, not the artist's feelings or the natures of men who are all too human like himself, that are the legitimate theme of art. If a poet cannot imitate the eternal realities, but only the vagaries of human character, there can be no place for him in an ideal society, however true or intriguing his representations may be. The Assyriologist André is speaking in perfect accord with Plato when he says, in connection with pottery, that it is the business of art to grasp the primordial truth, to make the inaudible audible, to enunciate the primordial word, to reproduce the primordial images, or it is not art. In other words, a real art is one of symbolic and significant representation, a representation of things that cannot be seen except by the intellect. In this sense, art is the antithesis of what we mean by visual education, For this has in mind to tell us what things that we do not see but might see look like. It is the natural instinct of a child to work from within outwards. First I think, and then I draw my think. What wasted efforts we make to teach children to stop thinking and only to observe. Instead of training the child to think and how to think and of what, we make him correct his drawing by what he sees. It is clear that the museum at its best must be the sworn enemy of the methods of instruction currently prevailing in our schools of art. It was anything but the Greek miracle in art that Plato admired. What he praised was the canonical art of Egypt, in which these modes of representation that are by nature correct have been held forever sacred. The point of view is identical with that of the scholastic philosophers, for whom art has fixed ends and ascertained means of operation. New songs, yes, but never new kinds of music, for these may destroy our whole civilization. It is the irrational impulses that yearn for innovation. Our sentimental or aesthetic culture, sentimental, aesthetic, and materialistic are virtually synonyms, prefers instinctive expression to the formal beauty of rational art. But Plato could not have seen any difference between the mathematician thrilled by a beautiful equation and the artist thrilled by his formal vision. For he asked us to stand up like men against our instinctive reactions to what is pleasant or unpleasant, or to admire in works of art not their aesthetic surfaces, but the logic or right reason of their composition. And so naturally he points out that the beauty of the straight line and the circle, and the plane and the solid figures formed from these, is not like other things relative, but always absolutely beautiful. Taken together with all that he has to say elsewhere of the humanistic art that was coming into fashion in his own time, and with what he has to say of Egyptian art, this amounts to an endorsement of Greek archaic and Greek geometric art, the arts that really correspond to the content of those myths and fairy tales that he held in such high respect and so often quotes. Translated into more familiar terms, this means that from this intellectual point of view, the art of the American Indian sand painting is superior in kind to any painting that has been done in Europe or white America within the last several centuries. As the director of one of the 5 greatest museums in our eastern states has more than once remarked to me, from the Stone Age until now, what a decline. He meant, of course, a decline in intellectuality, not in comfort. It should be one of the functions of a well-organized museum exhibition to deflate the illusion of progress. At this point I must digress to correct a widespread confusion. There exists a general impression that modern abstract art is in some way like and related to, or even inspired by, the formality in primitive art. The likeness is altogether superficial. Our abstraction is nothing but a mannerism. Neolithic art is abstract, or rather algebraic, because it is only an algebraical form that can be the single form of very different things. The forms of early Greek are what they are because it is only in such forms that the polar balance of physical and metaphysical can be maintained. To have forgotten, as Bernheimer recently said, this purpose before the mirage of absolute patterns and designs is perhaps the fundamental fallacy of the abstract movement in art. The modern abstractionist forgets that the Neolithic formalist was not an interior decorator, but a metaphysical man who saw life whole and had to live by his wits, one who did not, as we seek to, live by bread alone. For as the anthropologists assure us, primitive cultures provided for the needs of the soul and the body at one and the same time. The museum exhibition should amount to an exhortation to return to these savage levels of culture. The natural effect of the museum exhibition will be to lead the public to inquire why it is that objects of museum quality, so-called, are to be found only in museums and are not in daily use and readily obtainable. For the museum objects, on the whole, were not originally treasures made to be seen in glass cases, but rather common objects of the marketplace that could have been bought and used by anyone. What underlies the deterioration in the quality of our environment? Why should we have to depend as much as we do upon antiques? The only possible answer will again reveal the essential opposition of the museum to the world. For this answer will be that the museum objects were custom-made and made for use, while the things that are made in our factories are made primarily for sale. The word manufacturer itself, meaning one who makes things by hand, has come to mean a salesman who gets things made for him by machinery. The museum objects were humanly made by responsible men for whom their means of livelihood was a vocation and a profession. The museum objects were made by free men. Have those in our department stores been made by free men? Let us not take the answer for granted. When Plato lays it down that the arts shall care for the bodies and souls of your citizens, and that only things that are sane and free, and not any shameful things unbecoming free men, are to be made, it is as much to say that the artist in whatever material must be a free man, not meaning thereby an emancipated artist in the vulgar sense of one having no obligation or commitment of any kind, but a man emancipated from the despotism of the salesman. If the artist is to represent the eternal realities, he must have known them as they are. In other words, an active imagination in which the idea to be represented is first clothed in an imitable form must have preceded the operation in which this form is to be embodied in the actual material. The first of these acts is called free, the latter servile. But it is only if the first be omitted that the word servile acquires a dishonorable connotation. It hardly needs demonstration that our methods of manufacture are, in this shameful sense, servile, or it can be denied that the industrial system for which these methods are indispensable is unfit for free men. A system of manufacture, or rather of quantity production dominated by money values, presupposes that there shall be two different kinds of makers: privileged artists who may be inspired, and the underprivileged laborers, unimaginative by hypothesis, since they are asked only to make what other men have imagined. As Eric Gill put it, on the one hand we have the artist concerned solely to express himself. On the other is the workman deprived of any self to express. It has often been claimed that the production of fine art are useless. It would seem to be a mockery to speak of a society as free where it is only the makers of useless things and not the makers of utilities that can be called free, except in the sense that we are all free to work or starve. It is then by the notion of vocational making, as distinguished from earning one's living by working at a job, regardless of what it may be, that the difference between the museum objects and those in the department store can be best explained. Under these conditions, which have been those of all non-industrial societies, that is to say, when each man makes one kind of thing, doing only that kind of work for which he is fitted by his own nature, and for which he is therefore destined, Plato reminds us that more will be done, and better done, than in any other way. Under these conditions, a man at work is doing what he likes best, and the pleasure that he takes in his work perfects the operation. We see the evidence of this pleasure in museum objects, but not in the products of chain belt operation, which are more like those of the chain gang than like those of men who enjoy their work. Our hankering for a state of leisure, or leisure state, is the proof of the fact that most of us are working in a task to which we can never have been called by anyone but a salesman, certainly not by God or by our own natures. Traditional craftsmen whom I have known in the East cannot be dragged away from their work, and will work overtime to their own pecuniary loss. We have gone so far as to divorce work from culture, and to think of culture as something to be acquired in hours of leisure. But there can be only a hothouse and unreal culture where work itself is not its means. If culture does not show itself in all we make, we are not cultured. We ourselves have lost this vocational way of living, the way that Plato made his type of justice. And there can be no better proof of the depth of our loss than the fact that we have destroyed the cultures of all other peoples whom the withering touch of our civilization has reached. In order to understand the works of art that we are asked to look at, it will not do to explain them in the terms of our own psychology and our aesthetics. To do so would be a pathetic fallacy. We shall not have understood these arts until we can think about them as their authors did. The docent will have to instruct us in the elements of what will seem a strange language. Though we know its terms, it is with very different meanings that we nowadays employ them. The meaning of such terms as art, nature, inspiration, form, ornament, and aesthetic will have to be explained to our public in words of 2 syllables. For none of these terms are used in the traditional philosophy as we use them today. We shall have to begin by discarding the term aesthetic altogether, for these arts were not produced for the delectation of the senses. The Greek original of this modern word means nothing but sensation or reaction to external stimuli. The sensibility implied by the word aesthesis is present in plants, animals, and man. It is what the biologist calls irritability. These sensations, which are the passions or motions of the psychologist, are the driving forces of instinct. Plato asks us to stand up like men against the pulls of pleasure and pain. For these, as the word passion implies, are pleasant and unpleasant experiences to which we are subjected. They are not acts on our part, but things done to us. Only the judgment and appreciation of art is an activity. Aesthetic experience is of the skin you love to touch or the fruit you love to taste. Disinterested aesthetic contemplation is a contradiction in terms and a pure nonsense. Art is an intellectual, not a physical virtue. Beauty has to do with knowledge and goodness, of which it is precisely the attractive aspect. And since it is by its beauty that we are attracted to a work, its beauty is evidently a means to an end, not itself the end of art. The purpose of art is always one of effective communication. The man of action, then, will not be content to substitute the knowledge of what he likes for an understanding judgment. He will not merely enjoy what he should use, those who merely enjoy what we call aesthetes rightly. It is not the aesthetic surfaces of works of art, but the right reason or logic of the composition that will concern him. Now the composition of such works as we are exhibiting is not for aesthetic, but for expressive reasons. The fundamental judgment is of the degree of the artist's success in giving clear expression to the theme of his work. In order to answer the question, has the thing been well said, it will evidently be necessary for us to know what it was that was to be said. It is for this reason that in every discussion of works of art we must begin with their subject matter. We take account, in other words, of the form of the work. Form in the traditional philosophy does not mean tangible shape, but is synonymous with idea and even with soul. The soul, for example, is called the form of the body. If there be a real unity of form and matter such as we expect in a work of art, the shape of its body will express its form, which is that of the pattern in the artist's mind, to which pattern or image he molds the material shape. The degree of his success in this imitative operation is the measure of the work's perfection. So God is said to have called his creation good, because it conformed to the intelligible pattern according to which he had worked. It is in the same way that the human workman still speaks of truing his work. The formality of a work is its beauty, its informality, its ugliness. If it is uninformed, it will be shapeless. Everything must be in good form. In the same way, art is nothing tangible. We cannot call a painting art. As the words artifact and artificial imply, the thing made is a work of art, made by art, but not itself art. The art remains in the artist. and is the knowledge by which things are made. What is made according to the art is correct. What one makes as one likes may very well be awkward. We must not confuse taste with judgment, or loveliness with beauty. For as Augustine says, some people like deformities. Works of art are generally ornamental, or in some way ornamented. The docent will sometimes discuss the history of ornament. In doing so, he will explain that all the words that mean ornament or decoration in the four languages with which we are chiefly concerned, and probably in all languages, originally meant equipment, just as furnishing originally meant tables and chairs for use, and not an interior decoration designed to keep up with the Joneses or to display our connoisseurship. We must not think of ornament as something added to an object which might have been ugly without it. The beauty of anything unadorned is not increased by ornament, but made more effective by it. Ornament is characterization. Ornaments are attributes. We are often told, and not quite incorrectly, the primitive ornament had a magical value. It would be truer to say a metaphysical value, since it is generally by means of what we now call its decoration that a thing is ritually transformed and made to function spiritually as well as physically. The use of solar symbols in harness, for example, makes the steed the sun in a likeness. Solar patterns are appropriate to buttons because the sun himself is the primordial fastening to which all things are attached by the thread of the spirit. The egg and dart pattern was originally what it still is in India, a lotus petal, molding symbolic of a solid foundation. It is only when the symbolic values of ornament have been lost that decoration becomes a sophistry, irresponsible to the content of the work. For Socrates, the distinction of beauty from use is logical, but not real, not objective. A thing can only be beautiful in the context for which it is designed. Critics nowadays speak of an artist as inspired by external objects, or even by his material. This is a misuse of language that makes it impossible for the student to understand the earlier literature or art. Inspiration can never mean anything but the working of some spiritual force within you. The word is properly defined by Webster as a supernatural divine influence. The docent, if a rationalist, may wish to deny the possibility of inspiration, but he must not obscure the fact that from Homer onwards the word has been used always with one exact meaning, that of Dante when he says that love, that is to say the Holy Ghost, inspires him, and that he goes setting the matter forth, even as he dictates within me. Nature, for example, in the statement, art imitates nature in her manner of operation, does not refer to any invisible part of our environment. And when Plato says, according to nature, he does not mean as things behave, but as they should behave, not sinning against nature. The traditional nature is Mother Nature, that principle by which things are natured, by which, for example, a horse is horsey, and by which a man is human. Art is an imitation of the nature of things, not of their appearances. In these ways, we shall prepare our public to understand the pertinence of ancient works of art. If, on the other hand, we ignore the evidence and decide that the appreciation of art is merely an aesthetic experience, we shall evidently arrange our exhibition to appeal to the public's sensibilities. This is to assume that the public must be taught to feel. But the view that the public is a hard-hearted animal is strangely at variance with the evidence afforded by the kind of art that the public chooses for itself without the help of museums. For we perceive that this public already knows what it likes. It likes fine colors and sounds, and whatever is spectacular or personal or anecdotal, or that flatters its faith in progress. This public loves its comfort. If we believe that the appreciation of art is an aesthetic experience, we shall give the public what it wants. But it is not the function of a museum or of any educator to flatter and amuse the public. If the exhibition of works of art, like the reading of books, is to have a cultural value, i.e., if it is to nourish and make the best part of us grow, as plants are nourished and grow in suitable soils. It is to the understanding, and not to fine feelings, that an appeal must be made. In one respect, the public is right. It always wants to know what a work of art is about. About what, as Plato asked, does the sophist make us so eloquent? Let us tell them what these works of art are about, and not merely tell them things about these works of art. Let us tell them the painful truth, that most of these works of art are about God, whom we never mention in polite society. Let us admit that if we are to offer an education in agreement with the innermost nature and eloquence of the exhibits themselves, that this will not be an education in sensibility, but an education in philosophy, in Plato's, in Aristotle's sense of the word, for whom it means ontology and theology and a map of life and a wisdom to be applied to everyday matters. Let us recognize that nothing will have been accomplished unless men's lives are affected and their values changed by what we have to show. Taking this point of view, we shall break down the social and economic distinction of fine from applied art. We shall no longer divorce anthropology from art, but recognize that the anthropological approach to art is a much closer approach than the aestheticians. We shall no longer pretend that the content of folk arts is anything but metaphysical. We shall teach our public to demand, above all things, lucidity in works of art. For example, we shall place a painted Neolithic potsherd or Indian punch-mark coin side by side with a medieval representation of the 7 gifts of the Spirit, and make it clear by means of labels or docents, or both, that the reason of all these compositions is to state the universal doctrine of the 7 rays of the sun. We shall put together an Egyptian representation of the sun door guarded by the sun himself, and the figure of the Pantocrator in the oculus of a Byzantine dome, and explain that these doors by which one breaks out of the universe are the same as the hole in the roof by which an American Indian enters and leaves his hogan, the same as the hole in the center of a Chinese pie, the same as the loofah of the Siberian shaman's yurt, and the same as the forearm of the roof above the altar of Jupiter Terminus, explaining that all these constructions are reminders of the door god, of one who could say, "I am the door." Our study of the history of architecture will make it clear that harmony was first of all a carpenter's word meaning joinery, and that it was inevitable, equally in the Greek and the Indian traditions, that the Father and the Son should have been carpenters, and show that this must have been a doctrine of Neolithic, or rather Hylic, antiquity. We shall sharply distinguish the visual education that only tells us what things look like, leaving us to react as we must, from the iconograph of things that are themselves invisible, but by which we can be guided how to act. It may be that the understanding of the ancient works of art and of the conditions under which they were produced will undermine our loyalty to contemporary art and contemporary methods of manufacture. This will be the proof of our success as educators. We must not shrink from the truth that all education implies revaluation. Whatever is made only to give pleasure is, as Plato put it, a toy, for the delectation of that part of us that passively submits to emotional storms. Whereas the education to be derived from works of art should be an education in the love of what is ordered and the dislike of what is disordered. We have proposed to educate the public to ask first of all these 2 questions of a work of art. Is it true or beautiful, whichever word you prefer, and what good use does it serve? We shall hope to have demonstrated by our exhibition that the human value of anything made is determined by the coincidence in it of beauty and utility, significance and aptitude, that artifacts of this sort can only be made by free and responsible workmen, free to consider only the good of the work to be done and individually responsible for its quality, and that the manufacture of art in studios, coupled with an artless manufacture in factories, represents a reduction of the standard of living to subhuman levels. These are not personal opinions, but only the logical deductions of a lifetime spent in the handling of works of art, the observation of men at work, and the study of the universal philosophy of art, from which philosophy, our own aesthetic, is only a temporally provincial aberration. It is for the museum militant to maintain with Plato that we cannot give the name of art to anything irrational.